June 22, 1941, Wolfschanz headquarters, East Prussia. The map room was dimly lit, filled with the hum of generators and the faint scent of oil and cigarette smoke. A cold gray dawn filtered through the narrow windows as Adolf Hitler stood before a massive operations map that stretched across the wall. Red arrows slashed deep into the Soviet Union, tracing the planned path of destruction. Around him, generals in field gray uniforms stood rigidly at attention: Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, and a few others who had dared to voice hesitation in the days before. Outside, the forests of East Prussia were alive with motion, columns of panzers, half-tracks, and fuel trucks roaring eastward toward the Soviet border. The ground trembled as more than 3 million German soldiers prepared to strike, the largest invasion force in human history. And yet, inside this bunker, the air was thick with unease. General Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg, leaned over the table. His gloved finger traced the Dwina River near Smolensk. Mein Führer, he began carefully, our armored thrusts can reach Moscow swiftly, yes, but our supply lines will stretch hundreds of kilometers. The further we go, the weaker we become. Hitler didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on Moscow, that small black dot on the map that had become an obsession. The Russian is finished, he said flatly. We strike, and the whole rotten structure will collapse like a house of cards. Guderian hesitated. Around the table, the senior officers exchanged uneasy glances. General Franz Halder, the meticulous chief of the General Staff, cleared his throat. With respect, my Führer, the distances are immense. Our trucks and horses will face endless mud in autumn, and in winter. He paused, as if afraid to finish the thought. In winter, it will be unlike anything the Wehrmacht has faced. Hitler finally turned, his expression hardening. You think I don't know about winter? Napoleon failed because he delayed. I will not. The campaign will be over in 3 months. The room fell silent. The sound of distant artillery echoed faintly through the forest. The first guns of Operation Barbarossa were already firing. At that moment, Major Gerhard Engel, one of Hitler's adjutants, entered with a report from the frontier. The Luftwaffe reports total surprise, he announced. Soviet airfields are burning. Our forward divisions have already crossed the Bug River. The generals straightened, masking their doubt behind mechanical salutes. It has begun, Halder thought grimly. God help us if we are wrong. By midday, the invasion roared across a 1,800-mile front. In the north, Army Group North surged toward Leningrad. In the center, Guderian's Panzergruppe II and Hoth's Panzergruppe III plunged into Belarus. In the south, Kleist's armor carved through the Ukrainian plains. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground within hours. Columns of Red Army troops stumbled into encirclements as German tanks sliced through their lines with terrifying speed. For the first few weeks, everything seemed to validate Hitler's arrogance. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell in a matter of days. Entire Soviet armies, hundreds of thousands of men, were captured in vast pockets. German radio broadcasts trumpeted the destruction of Bolshevism. Hitler's staff congratulated one another in the Führer's presence, their fears momentarily buried under the euphoria of victory. But beneath that triumph, the cracks were already forming. The supply columns couldn't keep up. Fuel trucks broke down on muddy roads, horses collapsed from exhaustion. Ammunition stockpiles were depleted faster than they could be replenished. Every kilometer east is a kilometer further from Germany, one logistics officer muttered bitterly as he stared at his dwindling convoy. At field headquarters near Minsk, Guderian staff officers pored over maps, noting the growing delays in supply shipments. If we continue at this pace, our tanks will be out of fuel before Smolensk, said Oberst Nering, his voice low. And Moscow still lies hundreds of kilometers beyond. Still, the orders came: advance, advance, advance. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels prepared triumphant newsreels showing endless German columns marching east, the unstoppable tide of the Reich. Civilians cheered in cinemas, unaware of what the officers in the field already sensed. By early August, as Army Group Center pressed deeper into Soviet territory, Guderian confided to his diary. "The vastness of Russia devours us. Each success draws us further from the means to sustain it." And back in East Prussia, Halder noted in his war diary the creeping dread that haunted the general staff. "We underestimated the Russian. We overestimated ourselves. The shadow of winter looms." August 1941, near Smolensk, western Russia. The fields were blackened, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning fuel and charred earth. Columns of smoke curled skyward where Soviet convoys had been obliterated by Stukas hours before. Between the shattered husks of tanks and trucks, German infantry marched forward, dusty, exhausted, hollow-eyed from weeks without rest. Captain Friedrich Neumann of the 18th Panzer Division walked beside his men, his boots crunching over frozen mud hardened by the night chill. "Keep moving," he ordered, voice hoarse. "We're nearing Smolensk." Behind him, an endless line of vehicles crawled eastward, Panzer III tanks belching fumes, fuel trucks rattling over broken bridges, horse-drawn carts groaning under crates of ammunition. The blitzkrieg, once lightning fast, had slowed to a crawl. At forward command, General Guderian peered through binoculars at the horizon. The town of Smolensk smoldered in the distance, its rooftops still aflame after days of bombardment. Soviet resistance had stiffened here. Unlike the disorganized retreats of June, the Red Army was now fighting with grim, methodical fury. Everywhere, signs of a new reality emerged. The Germans were still advancing, but no longer easily. At headquarters, the tension was palpable. General Franz Halder's daily reports were growing more desperate. He noted that fuel deliveries were behind schedule by days, sometimes weeks. Panzer divisions, which once spearheaded every attack, were now halting for lack of petrol. The infantry, trudging on foot behind them, often arrived too late to exploit breakthroughs. Worse, Hitler's interference had begun to suffocate operational flexibility. In late July, after the fall of Smolensk, the generals convened in the Wolfschanz once more. Maps were spread, telephones rang, the air hummed with static as frontline reports crackled in. Guderian and General Hoth argued vehemently for an immediate thrust toward Moscow. "The Soviets are reeling," Guderian insisted, pointing at the red line east of Smolensk. A rapid advance could capture Moscow before the autumn rains. But Hitler was unmoved. "No," he snapped, striking the table with his fist. "The real wealth of Russia lies in the Ukraine. The grain, the oil, that is what sustains the Soviet war machine. Moscow is only a symbol." Halder stiffened. "My Führer, with respect, striking at Moscow would cripple their command and communication. If we delay, the Russians will recover." Hitler's glare silenced him. "The army must obey orders. Moscow will wait. The southern front takes priority." The room fell into uneasy quiet. The men knew it was a disastrous mistake. Guderian clenched his jaw, eyes burning with restrained fury. "Every hour lost brings winter closer," he thought. Meanwhile, on the front lines, morale was beginning to crack. In the ruins of a captured village outside Yartsevo, soldiers gathered around makeshift fires, roasting whatever they could find, a stolen chicken, a handful of potatoes. The locals had fled or been killed, supplies from Germany were nowhere in sight. "Still no resupply?" Neumann asked his sergeant. "Nothing, Herr Hauptmann," came the reply. "Fuel's half gone. Food's worse." A wind swept through the wreckage, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of blood. The men had grown gaunt, their faces hollow, eyes sunken with exhaustion. Some still believed victory was close. Others, the veterans who had fought in Poland and France, knew better. They had seen the same overconfidence before, but never on this scale. To the east, the Soviet counterattacks were growing more organized. Trains from Siberia brought fresh divisions, troops hardened by the cold, clad in thick coats and fur-lined boots. They fought savagely, often refusing to surrender even when encircled. Entire German platoons were wiped out by soldiers who emerged from forests or swamps at dawn, silent as ghosts. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht began to fade. Back in Berlin, the propaganda machine continued to roar. Goebbels's newsreels showed endless parades of prisoners, columns of tanks, smiling soldiers waving to the camera. The people cheered. They believed the war in the East was all but won. But inside the General Staff offices, reality was grim. Daily reports spoke of fuel shortages, of thousands of frostbite cases already appearing in September, of engines breaking down from overuse. Even the Luftwaffe was stretched thin, airfields hastily built on muddy ground swallowed aircraft whole. Still, Hitler refused to slow the offensive. "The Russians are finished," he repeated. "They have lost millions. The rest will collapse before winter." The officers who had once admired his audacity now saw delusion in his certainty. They exchanged worried glances during briefings, speaking in whispers after the Führer left the room. Major Gerhard Engel recorded in his diary, "The generals are beginning to fear not the Russians, but the Führer's decisions. We advance into the abyss, and none dare speak." By early October, the great drive toward Moscow finally resumed. Code name, Operation Typhoon. Guderian, Hoth, and General Hermann Hoth's divisions surged forward once again, slicing through Soviet lines near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands more Red Army troops were encircled and captured. Victory seemed within reach. Moscow lay just 200 kilometers ahead. But dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then constant. The dirt roads dissolved into rivers of mud. Trucks sank axle-deep. Horses collapsed in their harnesses. Tanks, once symbols of unstoppable might, bogged down in the mire, their treads churning uselessly. The Germans called it the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. And with it, the Blitzkrieg died. October 1941, west of Moscow, Soviet Union. The rain had not stopped for days. The roads, if they could still be called that, were now oceans of mud, deep enough to swallow a man whole. Convoys that had once thundered across the steppe now sat motionless in the mire, wheels buried, engines sputtering in the freezing drizzle. Soldiers sloshed through knee-deep muck, their boots soaked, their uniforms caked with filth. Corporal Hans Reuter of the 3rd Panzer Division leaned against a stalled half-track, wiping the rain from his face with trembling hands. "We can't move, Herr Lieutenant," he muttered. "The transmission's gone, and there's no tow line left." The lieutenant just stared ahead, jaw clenched. Beyond the horizon, thunder rolled, not the storm, but artillery. The Soviets were counterattacking again, using the weather to their advantage. Nearby, a Luftwaffe Ju-87 dive bomber lay wrecked in a marsh, its nose buried deep in the muck. The pilot's body still hung limp from the cockpit, covered by a tarp. The smell of wet fuel and decay filled the air. What had once been the greatest military machine in Europe was now grinding to a halt. At Army Group Center headquarters, the mood was grim. Maps were spread across a water-stained table, their ink smudged from damp air. General Franz Halder stood over them, listening as reports came in from every direction: fuel shortages, lost convoys, soldiers stranded in the mud. General Guderian, his uniform spattered with dirt, slammed a fist onto the table. "My tanks are useless. Half are immobilized, the rest have no fuel. If we don't pause, we'll lose them all." Colonel General Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, tried to keep order. "The Führer insists we push forward," he said quietly. "He believes the Soviets are collapsing." "Collapsing?" Guderian barked. "We're the ones collapsing." Silence fell. Only the muffled rumble of thunder filled the tent. Halder closed his eyes briefly, then spoke in a low voice. "If we stop now, the Russians will reinforce Moscow. But if we continue, we'll freeze before we ever reach it. It was a dilemma no one dared put to Hitler directly. Meanwhile, the Red Army was preparing for its final stand. In Moscow, Soviet civilians were digging trenches along the city's outskirts. Women, children, and old men worked with shovels and picks as NKVD officers shouted orders. Wooden barricades rose in the snow, while anti-tank obstacles, hedgehogs, of steel beams, were dragged into place. Loudspeakers blared patriotic anthems to drown out the distant thunder of German artillery. General Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed commander of the Western Front, inspected the defenses. His eyes were sharp, his tone clipped. "They will come soon," he said. "We will stop them here, at any cost." Behind him, trains unloaded fresh reinforcements, divisions brought in from Siberia, wearing thick fur coats and carrying Mosin-Nagant rifles wrapped in cloth. These men had trained in temperatures below zero. To them, the coming cold was an ally, not an enemy. By late November, the rains turned to snow. At first, the soldiers welcomed it. The frozen ground made movement possible again, trucks rolled, tanks advanced, and morale flickered back to life. Hitler's propaganda machine declared that the final blow against Moscow was imminent. Operation Typhoon was once again in motion. Columns of panzers surged east through blizzards, their guns firing at ghostly shapes in the snow. Villages burned in the white haze, their flames muted by the wind. German officers wrote that they could see Moscow's defenses through binoculars, just 30 kilometers ahead. But then, the temperature dropped. First to -10 degrees Celsius. Then -20 degrees Celsius. Then -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid overnight. Oil thickened to tar. Rifle bolts jammed in soldiers' hands. Men's breath crystallized instantly on their collars and eyelashes. The Wehrmacht had marched to the edge of victory, only to find itself trapped in an unforgiving Russian winter it had never prepared for. Private diaries tell the story more vividly than any report. From the 10th Panzer Division. "We burn anything we can find, fences, wagons, even furniture from empty houses. The frost bites through every layer. The cold is a living thing, it tears at us. Some men simply stop moving and freeze where they stand." From the 6th Infantry Division. "We thought we saw Moscow's lights on the horizon. Now we see nothing but snow. Our boots are rags. Our fingers bleed when we load our rifles." In the forests near Klin, Captain Newman's unit found themselves cut off from supply. The radio had gone silent days ago. He gathered his men in a ruined barn, their breath fogging in the dim light. "The Soviets are counterattacking," he said quietly. "Hold your positions as long as you can. Reinforcements are coming." But everyone in the room knew reinforcements would not come. Outside, the howling wind carried a new sound, distant Soviet tanks, their engines roaring in the cold. Back at the Wolfschanz, Hitler refused to face reality. Reports of frozen divisions, of mass frostbite casualties, were dismissed as exaggerations. "They must hold," he shouted during one of his infamous briefings. "If we retreat, the entire Eastern Front collapses." When General von Bock suggested pulling back to more defensible winter positions, Hitler exploded. "Retreat is defeat," he screamed. "You will hold your ground, to the last man." The generals left in silence. None dared argue further. In private, Halder wrote in his diary. "The catastrophe unfolds as foreseen. Our warnings were ignored. The Führer's dream of conquest has turned into a frozen nightmare." And as December fell upon the front, Moscow's defenders prepared to strike back. December 5, 1941, outside Moscow, near Klin. The night was unnaturally still. The snow muffled everything, the crack of rifles, the distant rumble of artillery, even the cries of the wounded. Across the frozen landscape, German soldiers huddled in makeshift foxholes, wrapped in stolen Soviet blankets and rags. Their breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, visible in the air like ghosts. Captain Friedrich Neumann rubbed his hands together, trying to coax life into his frostbitten fingers. The temperature had plunged below -35 degrees Celsius. The oil in his Luger had frozen solid. Around him, his platoon was reduced to half its strength. Some had died of exposure, others from Soviet mortars. The rest just stared blankly into the snow, eyes hollow. From the distance came the low, rhythmic thud of engines. Soviet T-34s, dozens of them, moving through the blizzard like steel beasts. Positions. Neumann shouted, his voice cracking. His men scrambled weakly, dragging their MG-34s into place. The machine guns coughed, jammed, and fell silent. Moments later, the night erupted. Red tracer rounds cut through the snow as Soviet tanks and infantry poured from the treeline. The Germans fired blindly, their frozen weapons barely functioning. The earth shook as shells exploded among them, showering the trenches with snow and ice. Neumann ducked as a T-34 burst through the smoke, crushing a cart beneath its treads. He fumbled for his pistol, it wouldn't fire. A flash, a deafening roar, and the tank exploded in flames as a lucky Panzerfaust struck its side. But the victory was fleeting. More tanks followed. As the Soviets advanced, a banner could be seen waving through the storm, the red flag with the hammer and sickle, carried by soldiers who shouted one word again and again. Za Moskvu. For Moscow. At that very moment, far to the west in the Wolfschanz, Hitler sat motionless in his map room. A fireplace crackled in the corner, though he hardly seemed to notice the warmth. The situation reports lay open before him, each one worse than the last. The Soviet counteroffensive, led by Zhukov, had begun in full force. Entire divisions of Siberian troops, men born to the cold, had struck the exhausted German lines. In just 48 hours, the front had buckled. Keitel read the casualty figures aloud in a low voice. Army Group Center has suffered catastrophic losses. Units near Kalinin and Tula are in full retreat. The Soviets are advancing on all fronts. Hitler's eyes narrowed. Retreat, he spat. No one retreats without my order. My Führer, Halder interjected carefully, if they stay in place, they will be annihilated. The cold, the lack of supplies. Silence. Hitler barked. There will be no talk of cold. The Russian winter is nothing compared to German willpower. They will stand and fight. No one spoke after that. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, and, faintly, the sound of the wind howling through the East Prussian pines. Back on the front, that willpower was all but gone. German troops, retreating without orders, stumbled through forests and fields blanketed in snow. Frozen bodies lined the roads, men who had sat down to rest and never risen again. Horses dropped dead in their harnesses, trucks were abandoned, their fuel tanks empty, their engines cracked from the cold. In one unit, soldiers tore pages from their field manuals and used them as kindling. Another unit cooked the meat of a dead horse over a fire made from broken rifle stocks. Tours recovered later from the front tell a haunting story. We are no longer soldiers, only ghosts in gray uniforms. The Russians attack without end, and the cold kills faster than bullets. Sergeant Otto Meissner, 7th Infantry Division. Every night, we lose men who simply fall asleep and freeze. We dig graves in the snow until we can dig no more. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, 10th Panzer Regiment. By mid-December, the myth of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht through Europe was shattered. The Soviets, sensing weakness, pressed harder. Zhukov's counteroffensive became a relentless tide. Soviet T-34s, better suited for the cold, outmaneuvered the freezing German panzers. The Luftwaffe, grounded by frozen airfields, could offer no support. In the ruins of Klin, Neumann's unit, or what was left of it, fell back through a landscape of wreckage and smoke. Soviet infantry followed close behind, shouting, firing, never giving them rest. By dawn, they reached a small village, a cluster of wooden huts half buried in snow. Neumann ordered his men inside to regroup. One soldier knelt beside the fire and began to sob. "They said we'd be home by Christmas," he whispered. Neumann didn't answer. Outside, the horizon glowed with artillery fire. At Army Group Center headquarters, chaos reigned. Communication lines were collapsing. Units reported encirclements, desertions, starvation. General von Bock, his face drawn and pale, sent one final telegram to Berlin. "Without immediate withdrawal and resupply, the Eastern Front will disintegrate." Hitler's response was immediate and furious. "No withdrawal. Hold the line. The front must not move 1 meter backward. Any commander who retreats will be court-martialed." That single order sealed the fate of thousands. By New Year's Day 1942, the German army before Moscow had lost over 500,000 men, killed, captured, or frozen. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The remnant staggered westward, harried by Soviet ski troops who seemed to appear from nowhere, striking and vanishing into the forests. German tanks, once engines of terror, now lay silent, great steel carcasses entombed in snow and ice. The invasion that had begun with such arrogance, with the belief that the Soviet Union would crumble in weeks, had now turned into the greatest disaster the German army had ever known. And for the generals who had warned him, Guderian, Halder, and the others, there was no vindication, only despair. They had seen it coming, and they had been powerless to stop it. In his diary that winter, Halder wrote a final, chilling reflection. "The war in the East was lost the day it began. We warned him. He would not listen. The Russian winter has done what we could not, it has destroyed Hitler's dream of conquest." As 1942 dawned over the frozen plains of Russia, the tide of war had turned. The invaders who had once marched with confidence toward Moscow now limped homeward through the snow, beaten not only by the enemy but by their own delusion. And in the distance, over the wind and the endless whiteness, the guns of the Red Army thundered ever westward.